All right, our next presentation this morning is by AECOM. We've got Richard Fogleman, who is the technical director, and he brings more than 24 years of experience with FEMA floodplain mapping projects, the North Carolina Floodplain Mapping Program, and focused experience in GIS administration and workflow development. He has his BA in geography from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. We also have Kevin Nichols, and he is a GIS department lead at AECOM in Raleigh. He has over 22 years of experience in GIS, working on a variety of riverine coastal mapping and risk assessment projects, primarily for NCEM and across numerous FEMA regions. He holds a BA in geography from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And then we have William Hague, and he's a GIS specialist with over 11 years of experience, specializing in GIS applications, including database development and programming for NCEM and FEMA products. He has a BS in geography from Appalachian State University and an MGIST from NC State University. Welcome, gentlemen.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Richard Fogleman with AECOM, and so far today we've seen two presentations, and they've all been centered around North Carolina floodplain mapping, emergency management, and the flood work that they do. And that's a testament to them and how seriously they take flood inundation in the state and all the hard work that goes into it. Today, we're going to be talking about some 2D modeling that was used to increase flood awareness in previously unstudied areas of North Carolina. On this project, we worked with ESP and AECOM, kind of teamed up and did a large swath of work for NCEM on part of this. So our ESP brethren are here with us in case we get stuck. But again, I'm Richard Fogleman. Again, Kevin and Will are here. We'll talk through this thing. Next slide. So in our presentation outline today, real quick, we're just going to do a North Carolina Emergency Management and NCFMP, the Floodplain Mapping Program overview, and then get through all the other pieces of how we construct these advisory flood studies that we're talking about. So the program was established, the North Carolina Floodplain Mapping Program was established back in 2000, and they were the first cooperating technical partner state with FEMA, and that allowed them to develop enhanced standards to do digital floodplain mapping products across the state. A tremendous amount of work has been done, over 7,500 detailed riverine study miles, 17,000 miles of limited detail riverine, as well as 3,000 miles of coastal study in the state so far. So comprehensive coverage there that has been going on since the year 2000. Next slide. I think we missed more. Building footprints. Can't forget about building footprints. So around 2009, the Integrated Hazard Risk Management Program came into being, and the goal was to develop footprint data to be able to be used in natural hazard risk assessments, footprints and the attributes required to do natural hazard risk assessment. So as the state goes through and pairs these two building footprints and the hazards together, next slide, Kevin. We go through and intersect these two layers like we've been talking about all morning, and take those hazards and impart them onto the building footprints, and we perform risk assessments and communicate that data and come up with mitigation options. Next slide. And for the user, the North Carolina Floodplain Mapping Program has a website out there called flood.nc.gov. Users can go to flood.nc.gov, enter in their address, and get as much information as they want about their house and the flooding impacts and other hazard impacts associated, as well as going directly into flood.nc.gov. Over here in the top right-hand corner, you'll see some links out there, and you can go to what's called the FRIS site, the Flood Risk Information System site. Next slide. Oh, sorry, guys. So the Flood Risk Information site is pretty much where you get your regulatory floodplain mapping items, your standard flood insurance study components like floodway data tables and things. We have point-and-click BFEs to get elevations and flood zone information, as well as, next slide, Kevin, a lot of the good footprint work that we've been talking about as well. Out on FRIS, you can go in and click on your building, and you can see what your damages are, your building losses, things like that. So FRIS houses that information. In addition, you can go to the Feynman site, keeps building on that work, where this is the Flood Inundation Mapping Alert Network. also has the river gauge inundation boundaries, and you can see the severity of flooding based on precipitation impacting the infrastructure around there as well. And next slide. So a lot of this data, not only is it presented out on these great websites that you can go and investigate and determine your at-risk level, but a lot of it's used at the emergency operations centers as well for response planning, impact analysis, damage assessment, so on and so forth. We spent quite a bit of time at the EOC with Hurricane Matthew and Hurricane Florence, utilizing a lot of this great data that has been compiled. So with that, the last button on the flood.nc.gov just showed up this summer. It's called Go to Flood Advisory Site. So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today, is what these flood advisory or the advisory floods are that we have that we've been working on. And we've been working on this for 2 years now, and it just ended. I think we called it good like maybe a couple months ago, or maybe a month ago. So we're going to just quickly cover the study purpose and goals for the 2D advisory floods. Go ahead, Kevin. So following Hurricane Matthew and Florence, it was obvious that there was a lot of flooding happening that was not necessarily sitting in the state's defined flood hazard areas. Keep clicking through there. Analysis showed that a lot of those properties that were flooded outside of those flood hazard areas certainly did not have an NFIP flood insurance policy. Although North Carolina has one of the most comprehensive flood set of information in the nation, there's still a lot of stuff that's technically considered unstudied out there. So with advancements in technologies, we're able to do a lot of larger area studies at a lower cost than what we have done previously with traditional detailed studies. So that moves us into the advisory flood stuff. So as you can see here on the picture, this is just a picture in Edgecombe County of what you would see for your traditional regulatory flood zones that would be the first pass through the state. And through the 2D advisory flood effort, you can see how much more coverage that we have now to utilize for communication and risk assessment by integrating that data in. Next slide. And you can see all those orange areas are areas outside of that traditional regulatory zone. And you can see building footprints that are impacted. And a lot of those building footprints are the ones that during Hurricane Florence and Matthew that were impacted, and they weren't near a zone. So now we have some really good information to use to identify even a whole level deeper for folks who are at risk. So with all of this great knowledge, just like Amanda said, this thing was funded with the the House Bill 200. So the entire study that we embarked on for the advisory flood was funded through the House bill. Go ahead and flip through, Kevin. So we paired up with ESP. They had about half of this, and we had about half of it. We did about 80 HUC-10 basins across 6 NC watersheds, and mostly in or including areas that were in the Lumber, Cape Fear, Neuse, and Tar River basins, covering approximately 13,000 square miles there. About 35 counties were impacted. Keep rolling on slides. And over 20,000 miles of unstudied streams were captured. So go ahead and we'll talk about the modeling approach that was used. It was a 2D modeling approach that was used on this. It's great with mapping areas of flat areas or where the water may be moving in 2 or more directions. It maps both pluvial and fluvial areas with the same model. So that's called a 2D rain on grid modeling approach. In order to prepare for this type of modeling, we had to prepare the terrain data. So we used the North Carolina Floodplain Mapping Quality Level 2 LIDAR. That data was hydro-corrected. About 5,000 culverts were burned into the terrain to maintain that hydraulic connectivity across the road embankments. You can see there where that red arrow is, where you have the road, but the streamline cuts through. That was burned in. Next slide. And we also use the National Land Cover Data Set 2016 for surface roughness as an input to the modeling. So as a part of all that modeling, we were able to map a total of 13 profiles. Those models were validated with surveyed high water marks from Hurricane Matthew and Hurricane Florence, as well as IA claims or individual assistance claims that are filed by folks who would get flooded, got flooded. You could file an individual assistance claim for FEMA, and they would come out and verify that you were flooded, and you could get assistance even though you were outside of those regulatory floodplains. So the models were calibrated using some of that information. At this point, I'm going to let Kevin go ahead and start talking about all of the great mapping products that were derived.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. So once the engineering and modeling was approved, we developed 7 different raster data sets. These were arrival time grids, depth times velocity, advisory flood elevation grids, probability of flooding over a 30-year period, percent annual chance flooding grids, and velocity grids. We also developed flood hazard area polygons containing all of the 8 different events from the 5 to the 1,000 year. These were housed in the S advisory flood hazard area and can be looked up by flood event ID. The polys were created for each profile with minimum depths removed, and we also removed areas less than 15,000 square feet. And again, this flood hazard area was useful later on for doing our flood risk analysis selection to get the building footprints that were in the advisory flood. Next slide. Next, we'll talk about the advisory flood geodatabase. This was developed to house all the advisory flood data, everything that's being produced that you'll see in this presentation. And again, this has a seamless relation to the state's existing NCIRIS database related by building ID. And you can see here, if you click again, well, the building ID relates to all of our damages, all of our lookup tables. We also have the advisory flood model group. And this is essentially the extent of the HUC area, and this all relates as well to our flood hazard areas of mitigation interest. So a lot of domains, a lot of stuff built into this database to just effectively house all the data. And again, these advisory flood databases are stored by HUC 10 Basin, and the submittals were loaded into a seamless statewide enterprise database for view on the website, which Will's going to go over later. You can see here just a breakdown of the directory structure. Click again, Will. The rasters and all of our models were stored in our hard file folders just to seamlessly organize everything into the particular HUC 10. And again, all the updated existing building footprint data and any new building footprints we updated are stored in the state's NCIRIS database. So it relates to all hazards that were studied previously, as well as the advisory hazards. Sorry. Yeah, and here's just a breakdown of what a particular basin study would look like. We have the advisory model group. We had our flood hazard area, the CNMS lines, which we'll talk about in just a minute, which captured all the study streams that we did, and then our areas of mitigation interest hotspot grid, which showed the building footprints that were flagged for potential mitigation interest strategies. And we also had our damages and results table through the 5 through 1,000 year events. This is just a image showing the full extent of the mapping that we did. So you can see it covered these 80 HUC 10 basins. The total study area was 12,866 square miles. The total flooding for the 1,000 year was 3,500 square miles. So a vast area that AECOM and ESP produced for NCEM. So. Next, we'll talk about the CNMS updates. Again, the state of North Carolina maintains the coordinated needs management strategy, the CNMS, to inventory studied and unmapped flood hazards across the state of North Carolina. And then following the advisory flood mapping The CNMS data sets were updated to catalog the extent of the flooding captured from the advisory flood study. And again, you can see those there in the purple. And this is just one of the 80 Huck-10 basins that were studied. And again, these lines were added using existing unmapped lines from the state's CNMS database, and the line work was drawn to cover the extent of the 1,000-year in areas outside of previously studied streams. Here's a more zoomed in area of the advisory study stream. So you can see here in purple just the level of detail that was taken into account with this 2D mapping, and we added these advisory lines to cover that. Again, here's the full extent, which covered 20,466 square miles of advisory study that was added outside of what's currently studied. And again, these lines were added to a new feature class in the state CNMS database called the CNMS SBLE line, and it replaced any unmapped lines that were already in this database. So flagging those as now being studied. I think there's one more slide. Yeah, so you can see this sort of hole that's removed within these 80 hucks. So all the unmapped lines were taken out as now being studied. So. And then we'll go into the building footprint updates. And again, to perform flood risk assessments, you need the most accurate building footprints possible. So a lot of what we did was update building footprints that were in the 1,000-year of the flood advisory studies, and we also added the QL2 footprints that the state had as well. And again, to do these assessments, you need the Geodatabase. Yeah, so the Geodatabase requires these building footprint data in order to calculate the damages and mitigation strategies that Will's going to discuss here. Turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Kevin. So yeah, as we've been discussing, the building footprints are integral for a good flood risk assessment. These are housed in the building footprint feature class, which is in the NC risk database. That enterprise database is going out to several different web viewers. Kevin mentioned, Richard mentioned the flood risk information system earlier. We're going to take a look at the new advisory flood viewer here in just a minute. You can go ahead and click, Kevin. So as he was just saying, we've got a lot of new footprints. Go ahead and keep clicking to the next slide. You know, we're starting to see a lot of gaps in footprint coverage across the state, just a lot of new development. So NCEM provided new LiDAR-derived building footprints. We took a look at them within the floodplain just to ensure that you know, the geometry was looking good against the imagery, since we knew these were going into these flood risk assessments. I keep clicking there. To the next slide, thank you. And yeah, so just side by side, we were looking at some new footprints there. Just showing, you know, where you've got some new development, and now we're able to capture that and ensure that we're getting flood risk assessments there. And it's not just the geometry of the footprint we're concerned about. We also need building characteristics, such as what type of building it is. Is it residential? Is it commercial? What's the structure made out of? What's the foundation type? Is it on a slab? Is it a crawl space? And then to do the risk assessment, we of course want to know the first floor or finished floor elevation of the structure. A lot of that information, next slide, is derived from tax parcel data. CGIA has been collecting a lot of this data from the counties. This is one good use of that data. We have a tool that will conflate or distribute that tax parcel data onto the building footprints. We also use some census and HAZAS data to get some additional fields onto those building footprints. Next slide. And you know, we've got the 2D modeling complete. We've got 2D mapping, you know, raster products completed. We're able to combine that with, you know, your built environment data, the footprints, those characteristics that have been assigned to the buildings, and complete this flood risk assessment. Keep clicking through. So just very high level overview, you know, what we're looking at here is, you know, is a building footprint in the floodplain. So we have these mapped rasters, we've got footprints, we're able to see the interaction between those two. So start clicking through, please. If we take just one footprint, for example, we have a first floor elevation. Some of those are derived in the field, or others are derived from LiDAR. We know we have a water surface elevation from that raster. And so we're just, basic calculation there to determine a hazard value, or in this case, a flood depth on the structure. And in this case, just as an example, this is 1.2 feet of flooding in the structure. And as that flood depth increases, your damages substantially increase. I mean, you start looking at exponential changes in the amount of damage there. So all of those damages are calculated using this iRisk workflow tool. This was developed for NCEM. It takes all that information from the building characteristics, the hazard values, and does all the calculations to get the probability of flooding occurring against that structure, annualized loss estimates, your estimated damages to it. And of course, next bullet, there's a lot of QC built into our entire process, but also in this tool. Then afterwards, we look at some of those top damages. Next slide, please. So as part of this study, we also wanted to look at some building level mitigation alternatives. So not just, saying, here's the estimated dollar damage for this structure if it were impacted by a 1% annual chance flood. We want to see what kind of mitigation alternatives or strategies are available for some of these structures out there. For this study, we looked at 6 potential mitigation alternatives: elevation, acquisition, relocation, dry and wet floodproofing, and mitigation reconstruction. So using those calculations that were completed as part of the risk workflow, we get that annualized loss estimate. You can start clicking, yeah, thank you. And looking at that, and then some of these mitigation alternatives, how much does it cost to implement this particular mitigation alternative? How effective is it? What's the useful life of that mitigation strategy? We start doing all these calculations in order to come up with total losses avoided over 30 and 50 years, and ultimately get a benefit cost ratio to identify some of these structures that could potentially be mitigated against flooding. So there's the formula where we arrive at that benefit cost ratio. One more click there. So anywhere one of these mitigation alternatives was identified for a structure and that benefit cost ratio was greater than 1 over a 50-year period, that structure was included as part of the areas of mitigation interest. Keep clicking. So here's a high-level overview, kind of gridded summary. So this includes the entire study area, and inside the special flood hazard area. Want to highlight here, we're seeing footprints outside of the special flood hazard area too. I mean, these are footprints that have never been identified as having flood risk according to, a FEMA map. And there are structures out there outside the floodplain that could be mitigated against flood risk. So let's go ahead and get to the flood viewer here before we run out of time. So we have a workflow tool for this, just to load all of these individual basin databases into an enterprise geodatabase. Keep going. We also have basin reports summarizing all the engineering we looked at earlier. These will be available to download from the web viewer, which we're about to look at here. So yeah, as Richard was saying, flood.nc.gov, the advisory flood viewer is now available through their website. It'll take you to a homepage where there's some information. You can launch the viewer from there. And then, it's a pretty standard Esri web viewer. You can search by address, you can change your imagery, your base map, turn your layers on and off. I've got a lot of animations built in here. But the important one is down at the bottom. We have a slider for the water surface elevation. So that's the 2D mapping, the water surface elevation across the entire study area. You can use that slider to look at it from the 20% annual chance or 5-year flood event all the way up to the 0.1% annual chance flood, the 1,000-year flood. We kind of have a grayed out transparent area here that's showing the regulatory floodplain. That's the FEMA special flood hazard area that's regulated by the NFIP. To get risk information inside those areas, you really need to go to the flood risk information system. That's what's regulated to by FEMA, what you see on a flood insurance rate map. So keep going. If we zoom in to a particular building, we can see those footprints we were talking about, all the attributes with your building value, your foundation type, and using those attributes where how we got to the flood depth, percent damage on a structure, estimated damages. We have this for all those structures in the 2D mapping area. You can also click the event data reports button. It's not in this screenshot, but there's a shortcut link there to get that basin report I just talked about. It also has the point and click BFE, so you can get your water surface elevation for all those different flood events and also see a summary of the areas of mitigation interest for that particular area where you clicked. And then just real quick reminder, you can click buildings within that special flood hazard area, but there's not going to be any 2D damages reported there from this study. Again, recommend you go to the flood risk information system for damages inside there. So don't have a QR code like everyone did for the plenary yesterday, but that's the website, floodnc.gov. Their homepage will have a link to the advisory flood, or you can just go straight to it right there. And I flew through that last section, but that is it. Now we'll take any questions if we have time. Okay. Yes, sir. So the question was, is there any opportunity to work with FEMA to incorporate this data for people to look at?
Yeah, I believe FEMA's doing 2D BLE across the nation in a lot of spots. North Carolina's flush with data, you know, and we're using it to fill in gaps and capturing just even at a higher level. But yeah, from the FEMA standpoint, the 2D BLE is a large effort across the U.S. And David, I don't know if that 2D BLE they're doing, it's probably all Zone A, right? It's not a regulatory product per se. It's not AE, but they are using it to capture flood zones. And this is just I guess a third of what was done in North Carolina, and I know the state's actively contracting more of this to be done. So I think it's their goal to get it done statewide, and by getting all that work done, they're also able to remove those unmapped lines from that CNMS, which helps them with their FEMA funding and all of their grants and everything, to say, you know, to show how far they are caught up and how high level of a system they have. Any other questions? That is the actual mask of the regulatory area. So we took the so David's question was, in the gray areas on the advisory flood website, is that a masked out area of the actual regulatory boundaries? And yes, it is. So we just took basically the flood hazard areas from FRIZ, and we smashed those all down into one big raster and put them right over top. So the 2D studies they cover the entire area. There was not like an effort to stitch the regulatory with the 2D. So we did the 2D study separately and then overlay the regulatory on top of it. That's why they're housed in two separate websites. Any other questions? Thanks for your time.